decision. This is on the agenda for overview and scrutiny. Overview and scrutiny can make recommendations to any future decision maker over the planning application. Now, I understand is our own recommendation, is our own planning application? We've made a planning application?
We have 3.
Yeah, so we don't have to implement them, do we? I think even if they're granted, we don't have to.
No, planning committees for 6 October.
Okay. Good. Okay, just in case there was any confusion over that particular issue. So, could we start by asking the representatives from the stakeholder group to come up and speak to us? And if you'd like first to introduce yourself to the committee, just give us a brief explanation of why you're here this evening, and then talk us through any suggestions or issues you'd like to highlight with the committee.
My name is Cathy West, and I'm back onto Camberwell Old Cemetery. I've back onto it for something like 34 years, and I'm just very interested in the wider issues, the ecology, the service for people, the safety of it, just the widest possible sweep.
And Cathy, you've been sitting on the stakeholder group that has been talking. You haven't. Okay.
No. I attend a lot of meetings with them.
Okay.
I'm Tom Snow. I live just around the corner from both of the, I live in between both of the cemeteries, really. Yes, I'm involved with a group of people who want to set up a friends group for the 2 cemeteries. And the reason why we can't get on with it is because the council keeps hitting us with a succession of terrifying decisions.
Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. So, if you'd like to move on now to describe what you see as a set of terrifying decisions, just before we go into more detailed questions to you, just set out your position with regard to the current plans.
Well, I mean, straight away there seems to be a problem about what you've just been talking about. That a planning application has been put in, and I appreciate that the council doesn't need to implement the result of the decision making there, but it seems to be an application which is simply not based on any kind of transparent decision making. I mean, here we are. We've got a perfectly good stakeholder group which has not discussed the kind of details which are now in the planning application that are terribly contentious. I mean, can I go into the crucial examples? I mean, obviously, say Southwark Woods is going to talk more about this, but we've repeatedly expressed concerns about the fact that the council doesn't seem to be terribly interested in trees which local people take very, very seriously. And, I mean, one can understand that the outcome of an argument about this might not be favourable. But what has happened is that in both the 2 areas concerned, trees that are valued by the people who are looking at this, the lay people, have simply been left off the maps submitted as part of the planning application. They're just not there. They don't come up to the highly manicured and balanced criteria for what a tree consists of in the eyes of the council and indeed its key advisor who has produced all the paperwork for it. This doesn't seem right. You would have thought that at least one of the consequences of the vast number of people packing a local church to argue with your officers and with Darren about this, that one of the results of that would be a decision-making process that would look at these trees, but they've simply been swept aside. Another example is that in both the sets of planning applications, there are references to footpaths, and these are footpaths being driven into areas which have never had vehicles in them. No doubt, obviously, the bodies of vast numbers of people filling the common graves, numbering 300,000 in the old cemetery and an unknown number in the new cemetery. They got there somehow, but that doesn't mean cars. And one of the problems about modern cemeteries, and the cemeteries in Southwark in particular, is that people visit graves by car, and they drive their cars along the roadways to the graveside. And it doesn't seem to be part of the decision-making process to recognise that if you use these two areas now for fresh burials, you're going to be having cars in there. Now, an indication of how there isn't decision-making about this is that the plans clearly show little turning circles on the maps where the roads end up. One of them is right up on the top of D1, which, as the application says, is the high point. It's the highest point in the new cemetery. Yeah. It's got breathtaking views, and it's highly visible from down below. This is going to have cars being driven up it. Now, you can't just say, oh, well, we'll put some bollards up and stop people driving their cars up, because to do that would be a great act of disability discrimination. If there's a road there that can be used by a vehicle, a disabled person is entitled to go on it. And of course, one is in favour of disabled people being able to go to places by car. But that's one of the implications of using virgin land, and that's a term used in the application, for burials in the new cemetery where none have taken place in all the years since 1927. It's got forest on it. It's been kept as a virgin land. And in the case of Area Z in the other cemetery, of course there have never been cars there, because apart from a few pauper burials, public burials, in the late 1940s, there have been no modern burials in Area Z. It's got 48,000 common burials underneath it, with people up to 18 in a grave, and with no markers on the surface, except for a reopening of the cemetery in 1947 to 49, where it was decided to use up a disused footpath to make some more burials, and there are a few tablets there. So there have never been cars. Now, it isn't that the applications explain this, it's that they call them footpaths rather than roads, and simply don't acknowledge the fact that there are going to be cars. So there's one point. The other point on the which applies to both of them is that the council has not considered, in putting in this planning permission, that it has got an alternative method of obtaining these grave plots. And it's in the strategy document, whose author is sitting over here. It's one of a number of different ways of reusing graves in that strategy document. Yeah. But one of them is available immediately. And it's very, very concerning to see this being dealt with in the application itself with these words. The programme of reuse is not yet possible, primarily on account of the existing graves not yet being older than 75 years. Now that propelled three of us into the cemetery.
You've done some sampling, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And we found that we used a sample of graves alongside the existing bit of meadow between the existing gravestones and One Tree Hill, which of course is one of these areas that's packed with pauper burials. We used a strip of graves there, and then we looked in the next two rows of graves adjacent, and we looked for, in the records, those that are date expired over 75 years. And we found that 38% of them were available now, but only 28% of them were accessible. And the criterion we used there was a rule of thumb. We said if you can get two graves in the first row together, then that gives you access to a grave, one or more graves in the next row. And we only picked those where the JCB could get into the next row from the end of the grave. So we were very, very conservative about this. And the percentage that came out, 28%, if you apply that to the 3,500 graves in the new cemetery that were dug between 1927 and when it and 1940, and of course late 1940 is when the 75 years cuts in. 3,500. That gives you a round number of 1,000 graves, which are roughly in that sort of figure, which are accessible now and could be used.
Yeah.
And therefore, it doesn't seem right to have a system of decision-making that ends up with an application for planning permission from a completely false perspective. And when I've asked people why it is that when you look at the 2012 strategy, there is no explanation for why the reuse of graves doesn't happen until you've done all these Area Z and Area D1 exercises.
I think
and
I agree.
these
I think that is an
exercises are
anomaly,
going to
isn't
be
it?
repeated right across both cemeteries. Now, why does the reuse of graves wait for that to happen? When if the reuse programme started now, there would be no need to use Area Z, which could be turned into I mean, it's going to have a sort of nature reserve at the bottom, even under the plans. Well, why not the whole lot? Why spend £1.3 million recolonising Area Z by shipping out all the rubble that was tipped in 12 years ago, and then putting more soil on top? 1.8 metres of soil has got to go on top of the original hillside. Because when you take away the rubble, if you look at the plans and the maps in detail, which is very, very hard, I may say, you've still got a hill there. Then you've got to have 1.8 metres on top of the hill. And the only way you can get a decent width of soil to get 700 graves in is that when you get to the edges, you've got massive slopes. And
I'm going to draw you to a close pretty soon, Tom. Because we've only got so much time, but keep going.
To reopen, so the whole thing can be looked at properly and in the context of the alternative that the council has got available to it and is already part of its policy.
Okay.
Could I just very briefly say what we really want, all of us, is to save the beautiful parts of it that are already there, the beautiful trees, the many kinds of wildlife and birds and bats and things like that. There's competition about how many new graves should be done, but whatever methods used, we want to save as much of the good that is really valued by the local community.
Yeah. I think what may come out of today's session is I personally would like us to make some detailed recommendations to the Cabinet Member about particular areas of the sites, for us to name some sites, to name some areas of trees that need to be looked at again, issues like the fence that you've mentioned previously to me, issues like reuse. We may differ in our opinions on site Z, but I think that there are some real issues there. But I do think also that there does need to be, a real commitment to engaging with the stakeholder group on this and responding to some of the concerns that are raised through that process. So if we move now to questions to you, I've got a nude indicating anybody else at this stage. No, go ahead.
And just thank you very much, and thank you for the work you're doing trying to protect this for future generations. I think it's really important, and I know people are giving up a lot of time, so thank you. I wondered, one of the criticisms the opposition have made of the council was the consultation, and obviously we can ask officers a bit more about that, but I just wondered what your side of the story was about the consultation that's taken place since, I think it was 2011.
Well, I live very, very near, and I heard absolutely nothing about it until I bumped into Anne Stainsby outside the co-op in Forest Hill Road in January.
January of this year?
January.
And had you lived in the area?
Oh, yes, we've lived in the area since 1978. The only thing I would just say about the consultation that took place in 2011, and I stumbled on this on the website quite by accident, is that it also included an opinion survey, which it broke down by what form of body disposal people preferred. And very, very interestingly, the people who preferred burial like the others, wanted to see the reuse of graves, and that was the most popular means of solving this problem that they came up with. And it does seem absolutely astonishing that the decision-making process has completely ignored the fact that that's what people who want to be buried want. They'd rather be buried in the borough in a second-hand grave than not be buried in the borough. It's as simple as that. What's gone wrong here? There's something that is not under the control of councillors happening here.
So one challenge I'd put back to you is, obviously it's in my ward, these sites, and so I've got a pretty good understanding of the different types of areas that are being affected, and it does seem to me pretty clear that there's a big difference between sites D1, Z and B, and sites J, K and L, the walkway through there, and the surrounding area there, and obviously on a road rec, and the site between H1 and Z as well. This might sound like jargon to some people, but I think you'll be familiar with most of what I'm talking about because you've been so...
I can't remember which H it is.
Okay. Well, look, the point I'm trying to make is that D1Z, it seems to me reasonable for the council to pursue burial strategy through whatever redevelopment needs to take place in D1, Z and B. Is your position that there is actually some room for that? We could come to the issue of reburials in a moment, but is your position that actually that there could be a bit of give and take here?
Well, look, I mean, what more proof do we have to do than show that these burials can be dealt with through the reuse of graves? But we don't
or a
need
mixture.
To, but
that's the point I'm
we
making.
Don't need to argue about scratching away at odd corners, where in the case of D1 you can only get 134 graves in there.
Well,
for quarter
through
of £1 million.
134 families, that might be significant.
No, but
we shouldn't
sorry,
write that
I don't
off,
understand the question. I mean, why do we need to think about expanding into areas that have got other uses? I mean, Z has never been used for one single burial of the sort we now regard as a grave. It's never had curb set or graves or any other form of private burial, ever.
But it is would you not agree that Z is fundamentally different in character, say, for example, than J, K and L? Clearly, they're completely different types of parcels.
You're talking about the glades?
Yeah.
Well, it isn't different in this regard. It's a patch of woodland next to the most heavily wooded part of the old cemetery. And it has been used as such, and that's what it looks like from the road, because it is a woodland, and the woodland has recovered and regenerated and spread onto the heap of rubble. Actually, I know you're shaking your head, but I think one of the things
there are trees there that deserve
would be
protecting and
for
could be
councillors to come
protected.
and have a look at this.
Yeah.
I mean, if you'd allow me to do so.
Well, as you know, Tom, I have looked at it in great detail.
Can I just, Chair, sorry, because I think it isn't helpful to talk about letters, and it doesn't help everyone. So J, K and L is on this map. It's this sort of the bit that you wander through, and it feels like Victorian glades. That's the phrase. And then Z is the bit at the top that's fenced off.
The bit that's currently got the big fences.
Yeah, that has overgrown. Has everyone in this room actually seen the site? I know I sent an email. Has everyone been? Right. So it's the bit at the top, and then D1 is in the other cemetery.
Yeah, that's the.
And you're saying that your view is J, K and L are the best. Are you sort of ranking it?
Yeah.
And is that
But
based
the
on anything
bit that
other
hasn't
than
got toxic waste, hugely dumped all over it. That's. But I am ranking it. Yeah.
I can't find J, K and L on here.
It's on the Camberwell Old Cemetery down there.
Where the letters have been on the
it's burial. It's labelled as burial area, isn't it?
I haven't got the map.
Oh no, that's
one
the
map.
whole of that. The whole.
Which one have you got?
What you've got here
I
on
need
this
old.
map of Z
Old.
with this page is you've got four terraces going down the hill. All this is Z. This is motorway construction. This is very large scale.
Well, we'll come to that. That's a different issue, though, Tom.
Okay.
You know, I think the how wide those
But everything on
road
this
stroke
map
paths
is colour, is Z.
yeah.
Yeah.
I thought this bit was JKNL.
No, it's Z. All 4 of these burial areas are part of Z. Yeah.
No, I think this is JKNL.